Okay, our next talk is by Jennifer Girard from Yale University, and it's titled Synchrotron High Pressure Deformation Applications to Answer Some of Earth Science's Outstanding Questions.
All right, so yeah, my presentation will be quite broad, but I'll give some technical detail on how we perform our high pressure deformation experiment in our group. So the work I will be presenting, or the experiment I'll be presenting, has been done by some of our collaborators and with the help of high-end Chen beamline scientists for the work that has been done at APS. So this is a quick outline of the talk. I'll start with a few examples of important geological problems we'll have to investigate using synchrotron beamline and high pressure deformation. I'll focus on the advantage of synchrotron X-ray for high pressure deformation, and I'll give some detail on the techniques that we've been using, namely RDA and NDDIA, their advantages and their current limitations. And then I'll summarize the talk. The talk will focus on rheology, obviously, and to better understand Earth interior dynamics, we need to understand mantle convection and therefore rheological properties of the minerals that form the mantle. So this is ongoing work. We've been working on establishing rheological data, or actually rheological flow laws of the main mineral of the Earth mantle. The most studied mineral is probably olivine. Dislocation creep of olivine at high pressure has been heavily studied and probably really well known. Here's an example of rheological flow laws that I'm talking about. So depending on which mechanism you're talking about, it will be very different. Dislocation creep of olivine has been pretty well established. And so it is believed that the upper mantle, which has a large seismic anisotropy, is mostly deforming into dislocation creep. So here's an example of kind of seismic signal that we see in the upper mantle. The shallow upper mantle seems to be highly anisotropic, and as you go down in pressure, in depth, and increasing pressure, you can see that the seismic anisotropy is decreasing. So the reason for this happening has been under debate. If the upper mantle is actually deforming into dislocation creep, it could be due to a switch in deformation mechanism, a switch system. So from one slip system to another. But the question also is it also due to a change in deformation mechanism? For example, from dislocation creep to diffusion creep, which is a lot more isotropic deformation mechanism. So this is a question that still remains, since diffusion creep study under high pressure is still quite limited. And of course, this rheological properties of minerals needs to be extended to many other minerals. So work has been done on ringwoodite, wetzleyite, and some work has been done on lower mantle phases. Also, those are quite limited, like deformation properties of bitumenite is still quite not known. Then the other focus I should talk about is time rheology. So this is the first one I'm presenting here is the dynamic friction that has been talked about by Shun due to a fold instability. So I'm not gonna talk about this, but it's one of the time-dependent deformation properties we should study. This mostly for low pressure. Another time-dependent rheology that we can think of, and usually we think about, is transient creep. Essentially, that's when deformation of the material is strain dependent. So here I have like an example of stress-strain curve where you see the transient creep is what happened before we reach steady state, where the stress is constant as we increase the strain. So most of this deformation studies have been focused on steady state where the stress is constant, and a lot less data are present for transient creep. This is important for post-glacial rebound, like this has been talked also by Shun, but these type of deformation that's involved in post-glacial rebound are very small and therefore would involve transient creep. the main challenge here would be to measure deformation in that range of strain, which is with the current techniques we have might be quite challenging. Another time-dependent rheology, where time-dependent rheology may be important is when we look at deformation of multi-phase aggregates. So when you're deforming a single-phase aggregate, you get a rheological law. But when you add a secondary phase, this deformation might be largely altered. And this has been shown in the previous talk today. Here is an example of a model that explains how two-phase mixture could induce actually strain localization or strain weakening. This is a damage mixing model theory that was used to explain weakening of the lithosphere. So here is a schematic of a sample that's being deformed. You have a two-phase mixture. So when the sample is deformed, it's deforming under dislocation creep. And when you reach a large enough strain, so you get dynamic recrystallization happening. But because of the secondary phase, the grain size will be small and will not be, the grain growth will be inhibited by the secondary phase that would act as a pinning agent. And so you would remain locally, at least, in this fine grain, grain size sensitive deformation regime, which is a lot weaker than the large grain or dislocation creep regime, and would weaken potentially the aggregate. So another time-dependent rheology that is connected to the effect of two-phase, and another way to reduce the strength of a material is through phase transformation that would induce grain size reduction. And this could be potentially important to explain plate tectonics or plate subducting slab that would deform in the mantle. So here in this schematic, you can see some subducting fly penetrating into the mantle with no deformation occurring. And then there's some subducting slab that, for example, this one deform below transition zone region. And this has been studied by one of the students in our lab recently, where the student deformed olivine sample with a bimodal grain size distribution, large grain olivine with fine grain olivine in an RDA. So I'll explain later on what is the RDA. He deformed San Carlos olivine in fine grain and large grain San Carlos olivine, coupled with simultaneously he deformed ringwoodite, large grain ringwoodite. And so he mimicked essentially the pressure and temperature condition that you might have in a slab as it's penetrating into the transition zone, into the lower mantle. So it would control the phase transformation. Those experiments were carried at low enough temperature so the phase transformation would be sluggish, and we could actually observe phase transformation during deformation. So during phase transformation in the San Carlos olivine, fine grain olivine would preferentially phase transform and form this kind of microstructure with large grain of olivine and finer grains of a high pressure polymer space, like in this case was ringwoodite. And as we measured the stress in function of the time during deformation, here is represented the stress in function of time. You can see that the ringwoodite that was pre-synthesized, the large grain ringwoodite, show pretty large stresses. So is the olivine, but the newly formed ringwoodite phase show a lot weaker behavior. And so this would potentially explain grain size reduction, weakening due to grain size reduction as the olivine is deforming now. The ringwoodite is deforming now in diffusion curve. And if this happened in subducting slab, this could explain why the subducting slab would deform when you penetrate into the lower mantle. Another important effect of two-phase when you're deforming two-phase is when the two phases have different strength, like it's the case for the lower mantle minerals, bridgemanite and ferropericlase. In that case, this has been talked about also by Yongbin and by Shun, actually. You can see here, if you're deforming a two-phase mixture with the dominant phase here being bridgemanite, which is very strong, and the secondary phase being magnesiovustite, fairly weak. Under small strains, like it's the case for most of the lower mantle, nothing much would happen. The deformation would be controlled by Bridgmanite, which is called essentially a load-bearing framework. But if you increase the strain, this deformation might evolve, and the microstructure might actually form interconnected weak layer, where essentially magnesium grain would start forming shear band and control the deformation. And this could potentially explain what we see in the lower mantle. You can see the lower mantle is mostly anisotropic with some regional, the lower mantle is mostly isotropic with some regional anisotropy, especially in the shallow lower mantle. This is also potentially important to explain some chemical heterogeneity observed in the lower mantle. So here are like some important message about the importance of synchrotron X-ray in studying deformation of a mineral. Unlike conventional deformation experiment, the synchrotron deformation experiments will allow us to investigate stress and strain at a microscopic level, as well as the stress distribution within an anisotropic and heterogeneous deformation materials. And I'll show this throughout the talk. And actually, we can see the deformation at a grain level, not only on the bulk properties of the aggregate. So of course, in situ measurements is essential to determine steady state rheological flow law, but the importance of synchrotron is also that we can access time-dependent rheology and the capability of observing in situ some shear localization or transient creep, like I just talked about. And when we combine it with some high pressure deformation apparatus like the RDA or the DDIA, we'll be able to apply these techniques to look at a broad range of problems throughout the whole mantle, like throughout the range of pressure and temperature. So the first technique I'll talk about today is the RDA. The RDA is represented here. It's a picture of the RDA at the beamline. It's a portable device that allows high pressure, very high pressure actually, deformation to be carried. Essentially, it allows large range of pressure depending on the cell assembly you're using. I have a large pressure range because of really good support of the anvils. And it's a rotational Drucker apparatus. So essentially the strain is achieved by the rotation of the top anvils and could essentially be infinite. So here is a schematic of the RDA, the two anvils sandwiching a sample. And so the compression is achieved by approaching both anvil together and the top anvil rotating. You can see the sample is a donut-shaped sample. This is because it's a rotational apparatus, and therefore there is a strain gradient along the radius of the sample. And to minimize that strain gradient, we use a donut-shaped sample. Actually, we use a half donuts shaped sample with in middle of a donut, we put a strain marker to follow the rotation of the sample during deformation. For this typical apparatus, we also need to use intense white beam to be able to focus on the sample uniquely to limit, of course, strain gradient during data collection. So the data collection of strain and stress are done using X-ray radiography for the strain and strain rate measurement and X-ray diffraction for our stress estimate. So here is an example of X-ray radiography where you can see in black are the RDA anvils, and the gap in between is where the sample is. It's very small, you can see. In between the anvil, you have a vertical strain marker so that as you're rotating the top anvil, you can follow the rotation of the strain marker through time and estimate the strain. The X-ray, the stresses are estimated by X-ray diffraction. And this was actually well explained by Terrain, where we will use a white X-ray beam that focuses on the sample and perform X-ray diffraction on the sample. And this diffraction is collected by a set of 10 different detectors along different azimuthal angle at a constant 2 theta. And by following the diffraction throughout different azimuthal angle, you can estimate the microscopic strain on each HKL plane of your sample and estimate stresses for each HKL plane. So in the case of the RDA, you get a uniaxial component of the stress and a shear component of the stress. It works similarly for the DIA, where you do X-ray diffraction the same way, except you have a uniaxial component only. So the beauty of in situ stress measurement using X-ray synchrotron is that you access microscopic stress on individual grain population. And if you're looking at a polymineralic sample, you can actually estimate the stress in the different phases that you're studying. This is great, but it could also be really an inconvenience when you're actually studying anisotropic sample, and most of the mineral in the mantles are anisotropic. So here is just a schematic of how aggregate would deform. This is from Ashby Duvall in 1985. Essentially, the formation of a polycrystalline aggregate is made of an anisotropic crystals that requires grain-to-grain strain accommodation and the interaction between the grain with soft orientation or soft grain and hard orientation. And so when you're measuring the microscopic strain on your polycrystalline sample, well, essentially you're measuring the stresses in those hard grain and soft grain. And so when you're looking at the stress on different grain, you're gonna have very different stresses. So here is an example of the paper I showed you earlier by Muyundin et al., where he's looking at the diffraction of pre-synthesized ringwoodite with large grain. You can see large stresses spread between the different HKL of ringwoodite. This large HKL stress dependence, you can witness with this large anisotropy in the pre-synthesized ringwoodite. And so this could be really a problem when you're trying to estimate accurately stress applied on your sample. When you're comparing to the fine grain ringwoodite, you remember the fine newly formed ringwoodite, you can see that here you don't really see stress dependence for different HKL. And it's essentially because there is no anisotropy in this sample, because the sample is deforming in diffusion creep. Diffusion creep is essentially isotropic deformation mechanism. So you don't actually see any plastic anisotropy here. So to conclude here, microscopic stress estimate provide great information about deformation mechanism and or slip system activity within the aggregate, but it could be also limiting when you're in dislocation creep and you're trying to estimate accurately stresses applied on your sample. So this is just an example of another experiment performed in RDA on a two-phase mixture. This is when we deformed the mixture of bridgmanite and magnesiorustite using the RDA and actually it was NSLS1. You can see, so we pre-synthesized this bridgmanite magnesiorustite mixture from San Carlos olivine. So it formed this polymineralic aggregate. And we brought this to shallow lower mantle condition and deformed two large strain. So here is the stress and strain we measure simultaneously during the deformation. So in red is the stress level achieved by bridgmanite, and in blue here is the stress level achieved by magnesiorustite. And you can see there is a large strength contrast with maybe a hint of stress drop in bridgmanite, which might be at large enough strain, becoming a deformation that is essentially going towards homogeneous stress deformation. So when you look at the recovered microstructure, this is before deformation, where in black is the bridgmanite and in light color is the magnesiorustite. It's pretty no stress, like at least the microstructure doesn't seem to be much stresses there. But under large strain, you can see the magnesiorustite start maybe to interconnect. That could potentially explain this weakening that we observed. So here is just a quick summary of the advantage of using RDA, but there is some limitation as well. The RDA is great because you can achieve large strain and so observe in situ the shear localization and the weakening due to large strain. You also have access to a large range of pressure. In this particular experiment I just present, we were able to go to 27 GPa, but with appropriate cell design, you can go to much lower pressure. And the great thing is as well, we can load multiple samples and compare the deformation of those samples under same stresses, under same strain rate. And so just different stresses, estimate their stresses. Now, the problem with the RDA is to be able to use it properly, you need very intense synchrotron X-ray wide beam to be able to focus on the sample. And because of the large strain gradient, the ultimate goal would be to have a intense white synchrotron X-ray beam so we could actually focus in different regions of the sample. So within the same experiment, we could actually use that strain gradient and potentially map the effect of this strain or strain rate gradient, and in one single experiment, estimate the stress dependence on the rheology. So the stress exponent n. And you can also do the same thing by just mapping the strain effect. And also the goal would be to observe microstructure evolution, so X-ray tomography during the deformation. But to do that, we really need intense white X-ray beam. The second deformation apparatus I'm going to talk about is the DDIA that we've been recently using at 6BMD. So this is just a schematic of the DDIA. It's been talked about in the previous talk. So it's essentially uniaxial deformation. You can reach really reasonably high pressure, and you can conduct steady state deformation and transient creep deformation. And in this particular case, you can also stack the sample like Caleb just described and compare the deformation of different sample under similar stress condition. And using proper cell assembly, you can also perform some simple shear deformation. And this could be actually really interesting for faulting deformation experiment. The problem with using DDIA, and I think it's true for any deformation apparatus using X-ray synchrotron, is again, stress estimate is not very accurate because of anisotropy in the sample that we're studying. So here's an example of stress in function of strain for San Carlos olivine, large stress estimate for different populations of grain. So we don't really know what is the stress here. So to be able to study this, we actually loaded isotropic stress sensor PIROP, a fine grain isotropic stress sensor work. And we're monitoring the stress as we're deforming. And so this dashed line is actually, the thick dashed line is actually the PIROP collected at the center, and the fine dotted line is the PIROP at the top. And so we can follow the stress throughout the deformation and estimate with a better accuracy what is the stress level during the deformation. The other limitation is, of course, accessing accurate strain measurements and get, for example, here in the case of transient creep, we have only the end of it. We don't access whatever is below 1% strain. So that would be a nice improvement to have if possible. So this is an example of the DDIA deformation experiment that we have been performing the last year or last few years. This was performed at 6BMD APS on the effect of pressure on diffusion creep of wet polycrystalline olivine. So here is a picture of the starting material because we were trying to reach diffusion creep and be deep into diffusion creep regime. We had to prepare very fine grain samples. So these are essentially sub-micron grain sizes to be able to study diffusion creep law of olivine. And to estimate pressure effect, essentially we needed to estimate activation volume of the electrical low. So we performed deformation experiments on a large range of pressure. So here are two examples of our stress in function of time data. So here's at 3 GPa, here's at 10 GPa, at fairly low temperature because we were trying to prevent grain growth. And you can see our stress levels are fairly low, which can confirm that we're indeed in diffusion creep. And another clue that we're in diffusion creep, as you can see, there is not much HKL stress dependence. So that essentially is a good clue that we are deforming in isotropic deformation mechanism. So we collected those data at different pressure. We normalized the data at similar temperature, grain size, water content, and we looked at the effect of strain, the effect of pressure on the strain rate, sorry. And so we estimated an activation volume for this diffusion creep law to be about 2.5 cc per mol, which is much, much lower than dislocation creep activation volume, which is around 15, which could have a large implication as to better understanding why seismic anisotropy decreases with depth in the upper mantle. So the advantage of using DDIA, this is just a summary, is that you can use large samples that provide really high quality diffraction. DDIA can be used coupled with either white or monochromatic beams, so you have a lot less limitation as to where you're performing your deformation. There is also a simpler geometry because it's only uniaxial deformation, so stress estimate is a lot simpler. And you can compare sample deforming under similar stresses. With appropriate cell design, simple shear deformations are possible and could be potentially interesting for friction faulting study or earthquake study. So this is just a quick summary of the geophysical issue related to mantle convection that I was talking about initially in the talk with steady state creep. Should be studied more in detail for all major mantle mineral, especially effect of pressure and water on the rheology of the different mantle minerals. And of course, time-dependent rheology is another thing that we should focus on. For example, the faulting instability that was talked about by Shun, but also transient creep and multi-phase deformation. And to continue this study, some important development might be needed. Here's a summary of a current limitation that I've talked through out my talk. One is strain measurements resolution. This is especially critical for transient creep studies. Stress estimate accuracy. This is mostly important when we're looking at rheological properties in like dislocation creep regime, because most of our samples that we're deforming are anisotropic. Another point that I didn't maybe mention enough was cell design. There is some problem in some experiment with temperature gradient. So better control of the temperature gradient could be really interesting. And also chemical environment. Here I'm thinking mostly of water content, how to control water content during deformation. And finally, especially for RDA, it would be crucial to have white X-ray beam that are intense enough to be able to continue work on lower mantle deformation. And that's it.
Thank you. That was super clear and really well done. Thanks very much. Any questions? I have a quick question that just for someone who has never done these sorts of experiments.
Yeah.
On one of your slides, you showed, I think it was bridgemanite and magnesiolustite.
Mm-hmm.
The bridgemanite error bars on the y-axis, which I think was stress, were way bigger. Yeah. And I was just wondering why that is.
Actually, I can share the slide again. So it's mostly because of the X-ray diffraction quality. Those were performed, let's see if I can go back. Those were performed at NSLS1. So the X-ray intensity was low. And if you know, bridgemanite has a fairly low symmetry, so peak intensity is fairly low as well. And so when you do deformation on multi-phase aggregate, you get also a lot of pollution, especially in RDA, you get pollution from other peaks that might be more intense. So the X-ray diffraction peak of bridgmanite were a lot weaker than some of other peaks that were present in our diffraction. So that's why stress uncertainty might have been larger than, let's say, for MgO, which is a cubic structure.
That makes sense. Wonderful. Thank you. There's a question for you in the chat. It says, generally, we interpret creep mechanisms in terms of flow law parameters in absence of in situ and active microstructural observations during deformation. How do you think the synchrotron experiments can help us to resolve these issues? For example, is it possible to be sure if the dislocation creep process for a particular polyphase aggregate like quartz or olivine is glide or climb dominated when it cannot be resolved from N and Q values of flow law?
Using synchrotron. I mean, I don't think you can do it from X-ray.
Sorry, what was the question?
If you can identify deformation mechanism, either creep, dislocation glide or dislocation climb using synchrotron, I don't think it's possible. If I understood the question.
Yeah.
It's written in the chat.
Yeah, okay. Very general answer is inferring or determining mechanisms of deformation. Number one, is not simple. And inferring deformation mechanisms is impossible only by mechanical data. You got to look at the microstructure.
Microstructure, yeah.
Yeah. That is quick. Vague answer.
Thank you. Yanbin, you have your hand raised.
Yes, but I agree in general, Shun and Jennifer, but I think if you look at the data, that the order of your lattice strain depend, the order of HKL, different HKLs, which strain gets higher, which lattice strain gets is smaller as you increase the strain. That gives you some information about slip systems.
Yes, that's true.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah. Well, Yanbin, thank you. Yeah, but I don't think we will do this for bridgmanite because the error is so large.
Yeah.
No, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. The simpler materials, you can do it. Actually, I did it for MgO
when you improve your precisions, you can do it.
Yeah. For MgO, I did it in my 2009 paper. For olivine, I think you can do it. Yeah,
olivine you can do it. Yeah,
I haven't done it, but yeah, you need a little bit of calculations.
I mean, there's a caveat because you look at the order of your lattice strains, you have to assume that deformation is based on slip systems.
That's right.
So one has to be very careful. I agree. Eventually, it's the microstructure that tells you.
Yeah, but the microstructure and the synchrotron, like HKL dependence combination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jennifer, there's one more question in the chat that says, how do you prepare submicron samples for diffusion creep?
Oh, that was hard. We did a couple of ways, actually. We did some sedimentation technique where we basically ball mill some olivine, and then we let it sediment into alcohol and really collect after 24 hours whatever is left above, like floating. And that would give us something like 200 nanometer, 500 nanometer grain size. And we also used synthetic sample, sol gel, and sol gel also produce very fine grain olivine. And the sol gel technique is actually described in one of Fau et al. Paper that has been used before,
But we also added
that's right.
salt and peppers.
That's right, to prevent grain growth.
Prevent grain growth.
We also did very low temperature and very slow deformation. So we were preventing grain growth and following the strain that way.
That sounds hard. Vitaly.
Actually, you mentioned salt gel technique, but usually it's produce a sample with a lot of OH. It could be like up to 10,000 ppm. So it will be not very pure.
So we bake our sample afterward in gas controlled furnaces to remove. It's like hydrogen CO2 mixture to control oxygen fugacity to like about 1,000 degrees. But then also we did have water in our. That's why actually we had to normalize all our data by water.
Okay.
Yeah, we had a lot of water by accident.
Okay, so, but it's another way to study how the OH effect
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Jennifer. That was great.